Welcome back to Rupture, the World of BestGuessistan. I'm Wendy Lurrie. Today's episode is a little different, not just because of who's here and how many of us are here, but because of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about TBI, but not about the diagnosis, about what happens after the diagnosis, after the acute phase is over, after the scans have been done, and after the system quietly moves on. 3 people with the same diagnosis, same ICD-10 code, 3 completely different experiences, different treatments, different symptoms, different outcomes, because there is no standard version of a TBI. And what often follows isn't protocol, it's improv, trial and error, people being their own case managers, advocates and researchers, all while trying to survive their symptoms and still have a life. In today's conversation, you'll hear from 3 members of what we call the TBI tribe, in a discussion moderated by someone whose work exists at the intersection of research and access, to have an honest conversation about what survival looks like when care is fragmented, recovery is nonlinear, and certainty can no longer be counted on. This is rupture, not as a moment, as a condition. This is living in the after, when the system can't provide a roadmap, but you still need one. Welcome back to Rupture, the World of BestGuessistan. I'm Wendy Lurrie. Now, normally at this point in an episode, I would be introducing our guest, having spent the last 12 to 24 hours memorizing that intro. But I'm not going to do that today for 3 reasons. 1, there are too many people whose intros I would need to memorize, and it's just not going to happen. 2nd, I'm not leading this conversation, Kelly is. And 3rd, Marie and Jeff are not only friends, but they're members of the same TBI tribe as I am, so they totally get it. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Kelly to kick us off and introduce herself and get us going.
Thanks so much, Wendy. My name's Kelly McKee, and I am a clinical researcher really focused on expanding access to clinical trials, including patients, and looking for innovative treatment options. I'm going to be facilitating today's talk, as Wendy mentioned, and helping connect lived experiences to the broader landscape of finding new treatment options and talking a little bit about clinical trials. Wendy and I have known each other for a long time now. She's a good friend, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to ask our other guests to briefly introduce themselves as well. So, Marie, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hi, my name is Marie Wang. I work in governance, risk, and compliance and technology as what I call a chaos translator. And I help technical teams and executives understand each other so they can actually move forward. Thank you.
And Jeff, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jeff Shattuck. I work for Dell and lead messaging in the marketing world for Dell's telecom business, and starting to do more with their AI business. So yes, the world is ending.
Doomer or Zoomer?
All right, Wendy, and I think everyone might know you, but for those of you just tuning in today, can you give us a brief intro?
Sure. I'm Wendy Lurrie. I used to be a marketer. I used to be a chief marketing officer. Now I'm an author and a podcast host and the creator of BestGuessistan.
Wonderful. All right, so just a few quick disclaimers here. We are not offering medical advice. We're not offering medical advice. We are not physicians, and experiences really vary across all patients and all people, and we want to respect everyone's privacy as well. We're really focused today, and why this episode really matters is that TBI is complex, care is fragmented, and information doesn't travel well. So we're really going to focus on our lived experiences and how they connect to that broader ecosystem. So let's start out by taking a deep-ish dive into your TBI experiences. Tell us a little bit about your journey, your time since your injury, and about one line about really what you were seeking when it comes to symptom relief, function, cognitive recovery. Like, what were you looking for in terms of relief? So, Marie, let's start with you.
So in February 2024, I was on an airplane. I stood up on the airplane and I hit my head pretty hard on the overhead compartment right before takeoff. And that's really how it started for me. I think I realized I needed more options when I started having a lot of tension and pain in my neck. Um, and at first, I thought they were just my usual tension headaches because I already lived with chronic headache and TMJ. So neck pain wasn't really new to me, right? It was a pretty familiar thing I already had been managing. And I was doing my usual yoga and my stretches and all that, but something still felt off and different. And then I started experiencing more vertigo more frequently, and that wasn't really normal for me, right? So it had happened before, but pretty rare. And that's when I thought, okay, this wasn't just my baseline chronic stuff I already had been experiencing. Something else is going on here. And the whole rest and wait, wasn't really cutting it. I think for me, getting better meant learning how to live with what these new changes were and kind of giving myself grace to know that there is no before time, there's only now, and not focusing so much on the future, right? Or what hasn't happened yet, but really just being present with what this is. It also meant for me having a plan, right? So knowing what to do if I had symptoms and actually taking action on that. And there was kind of like a shift from more passive waiting to more active management. And that was really what was huge for me.
So, at what point did you go to the doctor after your injury? Was it right away as soon as you got off of the airplane? Wait, did you think, oh, things are going to get better? At what point did you really start seeking care?
I think when I started getting more of the vertigo and more of that new neck pain that I hadn't had before, and again, living with chronic headache and TMJ, I said, let's start with what I already know I have and kind of rule things out. So, I started more with like TMJ massage, specifically around that, which really focused around the muscles around my neck and my head. So my traps, my shoulders and jaw muscles and all the things that had been impacted, which at the time I didn't really know, right? But just that's kind of part of this. You kind of just do what you know and see how you feel, and you try things, and you're kind of experimenting on yourself a little bit. But doing those massages really helped me understand the muscular component and how significant that was, and that all this was connected, right? I think from there, obviously I'd been in regular contact with my neurologist, right? Doing my regular checkups, doing MRIs, nothing was off or concerning about any of like our, diagnostics and all that and imaging. So then I just said, okay, I need to do something more here. And then I decided to try physical therapy. And I have been seeing this physical therapist for the last 9 months, and it's really changed my life, right? I think the combination of the manual massage and also the strength training for my posture and just strengthening my muscles really around this area has really had a positive impact for me. I think the interesting thing was that I already knew my body well from managing chronic conditions. I was aware of how my muscles and nerves and brain made my body feel, which is kind of crazy to say that out loud. But, TBI like scrambled my awareness, right? It threw things off. It was this new thing that was added, and I didn't know where to place it or how to really navigate it at first. But, I thought I was able to tell the difference between concussion symptoms and my usual migraine patterns. But, it's the same organ, right? It's the same part of the body, similar symptoms. I had to like relearn my own signals through this process too.
So it sounds like from the very beginning, you sort of took your health into your own hands. You were already receiving care for your TMJ and your migraines, and this was just like an add on. Wendy, I don't think you had the same experience as that.
No,
Tell us
no.
about your.
So that was super interesting, actually, but a very different experience than I had. So my TBI happened in October 2022 when an Uber driver didn't look to see if I was out of the way when I was pulling my guitar out of the back of his car before he hit the button for the hatch to come down, and it went boom, boom. And I thought I was fine. I realized by the next day I wasn't fine. It was a headache that started that next day and that I've had since. And I also have a long history of migraine. But the difference between the migraine pain and the concussion pain to me was like I could feel the difference. So I also had a bunch of other symptoms that showed up right away, like sound sensitivity, light sensitivity. My balance was off. My memory was just shot and my brain felt scrambled. I just kept working, and I had a headache neurologist who insisted that I go to get a CT scan just to make sure there wasn't a bleed or a skull fracture or anything like that. And there wasn't, which was great, but it still left me with the same problem. But it was recommended that I get myself to a concussion neurologist, and that turned out to be not nearly as easy as it sounded. That was a huge access issue, even though, I'm in New York City, I had decent insurance, I had access to everything. I actually had to have my brother call in a favor from a friend of his who was a neurologist who could get me into the concussion center at NYU. In terms of relief, I mean, the hardest part for me in the beginning was it was the pain. It was absolutely like living with pain that came every single day at the same time. And like I said, some of it was different from migraine pain. I actually did a thing. I hired an illustrator to do something I called the illustrated head injury, where I just showed the different parts of my head and the different positions I put myself in to try and ease all of the pain. But what was important to me was managing the symptoms, the deficits that could be managed. So there were things that I knew could get better through rehab, which once I got into the concussion center, I had access to. But I kind of had to peel those off from the pain, because the pain, honestly, it's 3 years and 3.5 years and it has never gotten better. But the balance has, the vision issues have after rehab, the balance has after vestibular, the memory mostly has. So it's like I live with the pain, but I work to do rehab to manage the deficits.
So it sounds like you had care that was guided, recommendations were made, but you really had to call a friend, call in some favors, navigate the system, which the average American doesn't have access to or doesn't have the resources, right? You live in New York City, you are accomplished, and you have the resources available that many people don't have. And without that, you probably wouldn't be where you are today.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, getting to the concussion neurologist, who was also a neuro-ophthalmologist, which helps a lot. And then getting access to Rusk Rehab through her, because I was now part of the NYU system, made it a lot easier. But I've spoken to lots of people who can't get to a neurologist in the first place. I mean, and we know that it's 60% of concussions go undiagnosed. People just don't have access to neurologists. There aren't enough of them. So yeah, I had a different sort of path to navigate, but it was still really, really tricky. Even though I had the access and the connections, doing all of that with a brand new, fresh brain injury is like starting the video game at the hardest level.
Yeah. Jeff, tell us about your TBI journey and what your care experiences, played into it.
Yeah, sure. So I was drinking with Keith Richards, and he finally passed out. Anyway, sorry, super boring. I got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and you know, after the fact, the doctors finally decided, well, maybe what I had was they call it vasovagal syncope. So when you have to go to the bathroom like that, when you're urinating, your body secretes a chemical to relax you, and sometimes it overdoes it. And if you're a man and you're standing up, sometimes that can be a problem. So what happened was I fell backward and hit my head against the wall, and I had a couple of skull fractures, and I couldn't put two and two together, although I kind of thought I could, but I couldn't stand up. It was like I was metal and the ground was a magnet, and I just couldn't figure it out. And I finally made it into the bedroom where my girlfriend at the time, started, like she woke up because, I came in kind of unexpectedly, and I just remember she had this terrified look on her face, and down I went again. So anyway, the ambulance finally came and they took me to the hospital. And that was where things, I think in general, I got good care, and I had good access to stuff. I think the biggest issue with, at least in my case with a brain injury, is they don't know what to do. And even if they do know like what's wrong, like with me, they finally figured out, okay, he's got a couple of fractures, he's got a little bit of bleeding on the brain going on, here's where the damage is. They're still like, well, okay, I don't know what to do about this really, other than give it time. And so I was in the hospital for, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 days, and then I went home. They weren't going to let me go home unless again, she was my girlfriend at the time, then later on we got married, then later on we got divorced. Um, she told them that she would be with me 24/7, so they said okay, and she had and she made all the difference. So like You guys are talking about the difficulty of navigating something like this when you're in that condition of having a brain injury, and it's very, very difficult. Well, I had her, so I didn't really have to do anything, which was good because I was sleeping probably 15 hours a day and chronic headaches and throwing up all the time and couldn't walk and on and on and on and on. I feel like all that ever really happened was I got diagnosed. It was very hard for people to come up with ways to treat me because, again, they don't know what to do. I still don't think they know what to do. So in my case, things gradually got better over maybe the course of a year or so. And in that time, I noticed that. So I had been the creative director of an ad agency in San Francisco, pretty good sized one. And suddenly I had all this time on my hands. So here I am at home and I'm doodling around my guitar. And before I knew it, I'd written a song and I thought, that's kind of strange, and because it had always been difficult for me to like not only come up with an idea for a song, but actually finish one. So there I was finishing song after song. And finally I started recording some songs at a studio in San Francisco, They had a place where I could lie on the floor in the middle of the studio. And I started a blog. And one day I got this note on the blog. You call me, Yuri Danilov number. That was all it said. Turns out this guy is a former Russian military commander turned neuroscientist working at the University of Madison. And he was picking up the work of a guy named Paul Baccarita. And what Paul Baccarita was working on was what's called sensory substitution. So the idea was, well, part of your brain got damaged and whatever it did, it's not doing now. So maybe you can train another part of your brain to take over. And so I went there and I did their treatment, which no drugs or anything, it was just a physical thing. And after I left, it's not right to say I could walk again, but what I mean by that is I could navigate the things we have to navigate when we walk. Like if there was a bump, if there was something I had to step over, I could do it after that treatment. Like it was night and day. I just couldn't believe it. So that was the first time things got better. And so that was just random luck, I wasn't looking for it. He found me, and that really helped. And I don't want to go on and on, but there were a few other things that happened, but ultimately where I was left with, I had really bad migraine headaches just all the goddamn time, and I couldn't seem to solve them. And again, she was my wife at the time. She stumbled across this guy who used Botox to treat migraines.
Yeah.
And so I was like, great, I'll feel better and look younger. Sign me up. And so I did it, and very, very expensive.
Same.
The process kind of sucks. The needles are big, and the
And a lot
places
of them.
yeah,
And there are a lot of them.
and they put them in your head, which is not a cool thing. But anyway, after about a year, the migraines stopped, and they've never come back. Again, like I don't know if anybody can really explain it. Botox is, I think it's FDA approved for migraine treatment. I'm
It is.
not sure. Okay, so there's some clinical evidence that it works, but it's still a little bit of a crapshoot. People try it, doesn't work. In my case, thank God, it worked. And so then the migraines went away. And really what I've dealt with since is some changes in my personality, which have been difficult, to notice at first. And then once I noticed them, like what to do about them, some I can adjust, some I can't. In a professional situation, like when I was in advertising and I had to get up in front of a room of people and present ideas, right? You can't look like you've got a problem. Like you're trying to sell them something that might cost them several $1,000,000. And if you look like you can barely put a sentence together, they might not want to buy it from you. That's continued a little bit, but what I've found is I always just say up front, here's the situation. You might see this. If you do, nothing to worry about. And, if I'm not making sense, that might just be because I'm stupid. But if I look weird, that's because of the brain injury. And people are like, whatever, dude, carry on. So that's been really great. People have been really accepting. It's not even an issue. However, I can't go back to being the kind of in front of a worker, or whatever I was. Dell, I'm more, a little more behind the scenes. I mean, I'll go to trade shows and present and things like that, but, I don't do it very often. So anyway.
Wendy and Marie, did you experience something similar? Were you able to eventually go back to your career, or have you had to focus on different things?
Marie, you want to go first or you want me to go first?
Sure, I can go first. I think for me, because I already had the TMJ and the chronic headache or migraine, and I already kind of knew my body and knew my limitations. I think with, the concussion symptoms I was living with, it kind of required me to listen more, even more to my body. And what that meant was, sometimes I couldn't travel to like a conference, or just knowing that what getting on a plane would put my body through and my brain through. Marie, do you really want to put yourself through that? So there were opportunities I had to say no to, right? Professionally. Um, and, everyone, again, is obviously very, like Jeff said, very cool with that, very accepting, accommodating. I think that, there are just days where you just have to honor your body and how you feel, and you have to say no to things. And that could be gathering with friends or family, or whatever you have to do. And I'm very grateful that I have amazing support system and amazing colleagues professionally, and volunteers that I interact with all the time. So there were definitely some impacts there. I think a lot of my work is more behind a computer. I do talk to a lot of people, and that's through Zoom calls and such, or in person. Just kind of knowing how to plan, right, really helped me. So if I knew, you know, talking about a certain topic was going to be really taxing, maybe I don't spend, or set up a 2-hour meeting. Maybe I make it 30 minutes or 15 minutes, or just trying to get things done, but do it in a way that accommodated my needs the best I could. And people were okay with that. So I'm just very grateful that I was able to continue doing what I was able to do.
For me, the answer was a hard no, and not for lack of trying. I mean, I was 2.5 weeks into a new job when this happened, and I tried to do it for like 6 months. But the truth was, and the truth still continues to be, can't handle the stress. I mean, my jobs were always super high stress, cannot do that, can't be on screens all the time. I have much more anxiety than I used to. My emotions and mood are not as stable as they used to be. And there was absolutely no way I could go back. And I had to just figure out who am I now? And the first 2 years, I mean, to be honest, were really rough because I kept putting one foot in front of the other, trying to still be the person I thought I was, failing at that, but not knowing what the alternative was. And it actually wasn't until I started to like seriously write and do this world building project I've been doing that I found something that could give me back a sense of productivity and confidence. Because that was the other thing, that it stripped the confidence, just like stripping the bark off a tree right away. Because all of the things you're known for, Jeff, you were front of the room, I was front of the room, and all of a sudden we're not anymore. And all of your confidence just melts away. And it's like, who are you without the power of your brain? So I tried and I gave it every possible shot to succeed. Couldn't be done. Had to find a new path.
So let's talk a little bit about that juxtaposition, right? So you're having to reinvent yourself. You are receiving care, but you're feeling like you have to take things into your own hands because there aren't a lot of options. Let's dive into that a little bit. So, like, as you are having to let go of things in your own personal lives, you're also having to take things back and say, the care that I'm getting, it's great. The doctors are doing the best they can, but there just aren't enough options out there, and I need to step into that role. Wendy, let's go back to your journey a little bit there. Like, at what point were you like, I have to release this marketing executive side of me and become patient advocate extraordinaire?
Yeah. That was really hard. That was really, really hard. And like I said, it was kind of like a bleak 2 years. And in the beginning, I mean, you guys have both talked about this. At least for me, at the beginning, you just think there have got to be lots of treatments. There's got to be lots of stuff they can do. This happens to football players. This happens to people in the military. Surely there are tons of drugs. Kelly, I looked at all the pharma pipelines to see who was working on what. And the answer was there was nothing. but there was at least a bunch of stuff you could get started with, right? There was the Botox. There were the occipital nerve blocks. There were all the other nerve blocks, and then I went on to ketamine and mushrooms and Japanese acupuncture and Chinese acupuncture. But with every treatment that didn't work, like that long runway I saw at the beginning of like, look, there's just a ton of stuff we can do. That runway got shorter and shorter and shorter. And that was when, at a certain point I had to decide, did I really want to just keep chasing treatment or make the decision that I have fixed what I can fix. I have to live with the rest. And instead of trying to like run from my symptoms, how do I create a life with my symptoms? That was what it was for me. And that, like I said, took about 2.5 years, which felt like forever.
Of course. Jeff, let's talk about your journey a little bit. I know that you and your then wife really started looking for alternative treatments, and you tried a number of them. Walk us through that process. When it sounds like your wife at the time was really the driver there. At what point did she say the care you're receiving, while it's the best you can get, just isn't cutting it?
Well, so just one quick comment on the career thing before I go into that. So I didn't go back to my career. I actually did try. I went back to an ad agency and worked for a little bit, and it was okay. But I couldn't work at the level I was at before. And I ended up being recruited by Dell because I had been doing some freelance work for them. And, Dell's a good company and I've met good people and it's interesting to work on technology, but I miss being in a creative leadership role. I mean, I really miss it. And, I miss the money. I make like half as much as I used to make, which fucking sucks. It is not changeable. So yeah, so from a treatment standpoint, so the things I tried, I'll just tick through them. So the sensory substitution, I did the hyperbaric oxygen thing a couple of different times. I did pretty intensive one-on-one yoga for a while. I did the Botox thing. I tried acupuncture, probably a few other things.
Did you have nerve blocks? Did they do the nerve blocks with you?
No, I don't. I've never really even delved into that. I don't know what do those do?
Well, I know the occipital ones, I mean, they're supposed to like sort of I actually can't even tell you what the mode of action is. It was sort of the first line that the neurologist recommended to me. It was like the very first thing she said we should try. And I think they have helped people with sort of intractable headache and things like that. And again, like, we all know this, all the concussion meds are repurposed migraine meds. They really aren't concussion meds. So they're using
Yeah.
things that have been developed for headache. And I think the nerve blocks work in a similar way. Like, what's worked with a headache? Can we apply it here?
Yeah. Yeah, that's funny. The guy I went to see for migraines first before I did the Botox thing several years later, sumatriptan. What's the Glaxo? What was their drug? The first sumatriptan drug for migraine.
Well, there are a lot of them. Yeah, I was on the triptans too, though.
Imatrix?
Imitrex? Yeah, that was.
Imitrex. That was the
Yeah.
first one. So this guy was the guy. Super wacko character. A lot of fun. But we tried the triptan thing for a long time. I ultimately ended up using Zomig, which was a nasal delivery system for the triptan, which worked really, really well. It was the only thing that worked. It didn't reduce the frequency of the headaches, but when I felt one coming on, if I did that stuff, I could prevent the headache from happening, but I would still have the kind of hangover you get from a triptan drug. Anyway, yeah, so I tried all those different things and basically anything I wanted to try, I did try. Some things were suggested. But what I remember more than anything else is that people didn't know what to do. And they were very honest about that. My neurologists were honest. Everybody was honest about that. They're like, look, we know what happens physically when you get an injury like yours. Like, we can see that. We generally know that some cells in the brain aren't coming back and some are. And if they are going to come back, you can't really accelerate that process. You just have to wait and hope. And I think for me, that was the hardest thing, was feeling kind of helpless. And, it does affect your mood a lot. And I've dealt with depression a lot in my life. And so when you're in this situation where you just can't find anything to really do about it, and you've already got kind of a tendency to be depressed, that was really tough. So I was seeing talk therapists, taking some, some Prozac based drugs, trying that kind of thing. My, and at the time, my wife, what was so nice about having her in my universe was that whereas I was discouraged, I was like, screw it, I'm done. But she kept looking, and that was how the Botox thing ultimately came about. And that was the last thing I did. After the Botox thing, I like people have said, oh, you should go to the Balance Institute and you should do this and you should that, you should do yoga again. And I'm like, no, I don't think I'm gonna do that. I don't think it makes a difference. I mean, I'd like to do yoga, but I can't afford to do one-on-one, and that's what I need to do because I can't do it on my own. I can't hold a single yoga pose. So, like I think it was Marie was saying, you're just learning to live with it. I mean, that's the point I got to maybe 3 or 4 years ago, finally. And so I'm not really looking for ways to get better anymore, but I am always trying to find good coping mechanisms and just, things I enjoy.
How about you, Marie?
Um, just listening to Jeff talk, you brought me back down memory lane, starting years. I mean, officially got diagnosed with the chronic headache thing in like 2018. Um, and I think that there's a real connection between migraine and headaches and stress. And this kind of folds into the career change too, right? I think over the years, I was just kind of moving into different roles that had less stress for me on my body, which I think is important, and it certainly helped me. But I was on the triptans, and yeah, it helped me, helped with the pain, but I felt terrible after. I said, I had to go advocate for myself. I went to my primary doctor and I said, hey, like, this is like not making me feel well. What else can I do? And he said, well, you have to go to a neurologist. And I said, okay. And so there, I went on my way to see a neurologist for the first time. And, you kind of go through these processes with getting, insurance coverage on things, and you have to fail certain medications for them to cover, like, this new shiny thing, right? And at the time, um, they, the pharmas were coming out with like the monthly preventative CGRP shots. And the one that worked the best for me was something called Ajovi, I think, at the time. And I did that for a few months, and I said, well, wait, am I going to be doing this for the rest of my life, injecting myself? And don't get me wrong, I didn't have any migraines or headaches. It worked great for me. And through that process, I met, a community of people who had lived with headaches and migraines for decades. And these people, some of them couldn't work basic day-to-day activities. And I'm sitting here like, oh my gosh, right? Like, how different are our experiences, right? And you just kind of, you really learn to empathize with people and, really appreciate everyone's experiences and how different they are. And then at the time, when I went back to my neurologist and I said, hey, like, what are the other options here, right? Like, this has been working well, but what else is there? And she said, well, they're actually coming out with like a rescue version of that preventative medication in the form of a tablet, and it was called Ubrelvy at the time. So I've been on Ubrelvy for years now as a rescue med, and more recently, last couple months, I got put on a daily preventative called Qulipta. So that's kind of how I manage the headache pain. Like, that's a lot of headaches, right? And I wasn't
don't they count like migraine days a month?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's something else I learned too, Wendy, is I didn't understand that a migraine can last 3 to 5 days. Like, Like, I had to like learn that, like my neurologist walked me through it. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, people usually only track the really, really bad pain days. There's like a ramp up and then like a ramp down, right? That I wasn't aware of. So I had to learn that too. But, just that's kind of how I managed all that. I've been doing acupuncture for almost 3 years now. And that was one of those things I had always heard about, like, oh, you should try it and see. And I was like, you know what? If it works for me, great. And if it doesn't, that's fine. I tried it. But, I think it just kind of, for me, just always kind of came back to doing my best to manage stress in my life and, taking care of myself and listening to my body and, research, right? Like one of my hobbies is just one of my passions is doing research. So, how did I apply that to taking care of my health, right? And that's kind of why I was always going to the doctors and the neurologists and saying, what else is there, right? Like, because as I would learn something, I'd like go down my little rabbit hole and research and, see what else was there and just, go have a conversation, collect data. And, that's kind of been my approach to like how I, think about my own personal health care and my wellness. So,
Yeah. So let's double click into that a little bit, Marie. So it sounds like your neurologist knew that new treatments were coming out, was very open to having you try them. You were doing your own research on your own. Did anybody ever mention clinical trials?
no, like what Wendy was saying, there's not many neurologists out there for us who live with chronic headaches and migraines. And I was very grateful to have some really amazing neurologists in my life over the last couple of years. And, she would always kind of talk about, oh, well, this just got approved by the FDA or, this is now on the market. Like, what do you think about trying it? So while there weren't any trials presented to me, it was more like this is a product of a trial that, and like, basically saying, I have a lot of patients currently on it. They're doing well with it. Would you be interested in trying it out? I think it could be good for you. Like, and just kind of like, it was just like this two-way conversation, right, with them, which I'm very, very grateful for. And there's a lot of great organizations out there. Like I found this group called Miles for Migraine, and they do a lot of advocacy for patients and also making sure that there are more neurologists available, right? So from like a fellowship perspective, making sure that they the hospitals and all that have funding and being able to bring people on to be able to treat people like us, right, with our conditions. So I think it's like this broad spectrum approach to things. Like there's the patients and then there's the practitioners. And, we have all these amazing like nonprofit organizations out there that are trying to do the hard work, right? And advocate for patients and doctors and just bringing more awareness to this stuff, and I think it kind of comes back to education, right? And, if you don't you don't know what you don't know. And I think how do we bring more awareness to like, these treatments and, to your point that there's clinical trials out there, how do we make that easier for people to one, get a hold of that information? Like where does someone start, right? Like all of us kind of, we're just feeling our bodies and we're in pain and, we have nausea and we have all these things, but it's like, where do you start? Right.
So if your neurologist would have said, there's a trial that might benefit you, would you have been open to it?
Sure. Sure. I think, working, in the life sciences and clinical trial space for, a little over 11 years, certainly have an appreciation for what that is and what that looks like and the benefits that it does bring to people and helping them improve their quality of life. Um, I think, yeah, absolutely. If it, was an option, I wouldn't have said no. I would have at least considered it, right?
And Wendy, I know that you did your own research going on to pharmaceutical companies' websites, navigating their pipelines, seeing if anything was in development that could have helped you. Walk us through that a little bit. I mean, you know the industry, so you're
I
at
know
an
the industry. And that was actually what was so disappointing, because I just assumed that everybody was working on this. When you just look at the number of concussions per year, right? And it's a large number of new concussions. And then you take the percentage that of people who do not heal in 7 to 14 days, which is somewhere between 70 and 90%. And then that gets added every year. That's like a huge population of people. So it's like, there must be a ton. So I went to see who was really, touting their CNS, like who's really talking about neurology. And I looked at their pipelines, and no big company, none of the big pharmas were doing anything big at the time. There were like one or two little biotechs. I looked more recently, there was a little bit more, but there's still less than you think. And I think it gets back to the problem that everyone was talking about earlier, which is this is a really hard problem to solve. This is not like, I mean, I've had migraine since I'm 17. Everybody understands the sort of the mechanism of migraine. And by the way, migraine does correlate to likelihood of getting this long-term post-concussive, right? If you have a history of headache, chronic headache or migraine. But they're just I just think it's too hard a problem to solve, because I don't know that people neurologists, and they'll say this, like the mechanisms of what gets hurt when you have a concussion, right? Because your brain gets shaken, right? So where you get hit doesn't matter necessarily. And what parts of your brain are affected depends on sort of how the hit happened. But there's very little understanding of, like, I mean, I started writing about this, and I've been doing videos about this lately. Like, this was my brain before and how it worked on this particular problem, and this is how it does it now. Because I can feel like there are parts of my brain that just don't work in the same way. And I'm like I'm like forcing newer, not newer, less used parts of my brain to kind of pick up the slack, which is really, really hard work. But, doing the research was not inspiring. I just wasn't finding a lot. And then, I knew the migraine organizations, but I looked for other organizations that like focused on concussion and TBI. Kind of came up empty there too. When I got to Rusk, I felt better. When I got to Rusk, and there were a lot of people like me. I mean, people like me stumbling down the hall. I mean, literally, we're doing the vestibular, literally like stumbling down the hall, and it looked like you were at Lourdes, which was terrible, but at least you felt like there were other people going through this, because I'm sure you guys can vouch. This is a uniquely unrelatable condition. If you haven't had this is very hard to explain to people, and it goes on for years and years, right? And the recovery never comes, and people get tired of asking, and you get tired of giving the same answer. So it's a particularly isolating and alienating discussion, experience to have. And then you look and you see like nobody's really working on this anyway. So we're kind of all figuring this out alone.
And Jeff, how about you? You did a lot of research. Your wife at the time did a lot of research. You talked to lots of different doctors and specialists. Did anyone ever mention clinical trials?
Oh, they might have, but I'm not the kind of person who would enthusiastically join a clinical trial, because my experience with medicine has always been the same. It always takes its pound of flesh. So it might fix something, but it breaks something else. So I was always more interested in physical treatments. So like the sensory substitution treatment, that didn't involve drugs. It involved placing an electrode on your tongue to stimulate your taste buds, taste center in the brain, while you stood in what they called a balanced, I don't know why this happens, a balanced challenging position. And that made sense to me. The hyperbaric oxygen made sense to me. It's going to push oxygen deeper into your cells. Oxygen helps cells be healthy. My dad said he thought it made a difference. But there, the drug therapies and whatnot, I was never interested. What I was most interested in, so the nature of my injury was in the back of my head, kind of, where, and the cerebellum is sort of a cross brain thing. Like, it's a really old part of your brain. So, there's a little bit of it underneath the right and a little bit of it underneath the left. And I was really interested in how those two hemispheres interact to create, a thought or a joke or, whatever, speech. And so I dove into that a lot. But save for the sensory substitution, I've never read about, a treatment that might help, a broken part of the brain, help a healthy part of the brain. This whole neuroplasticity thing, take a healthy part of the brain and give it an additional job. The work that I became aware of that was going on in Madison. That's the only thing I've ever become aware. That's the only thing I've ever learned about. But as we've had this conversation, afterwards, I'm gonna go into perplexity and ask a bunch of questions, because the beauty of AI is that whether it can write a letter for you or not, I don't really care about that. But as a research tool, it's just unbelievable. And so, like, if you wanted to know about clinical trials, ask ChatGPT or Perplexity or Claude or Grok, or pick your poison. And that'll probably be the fastest way to becoming aware of what's out there. That's
But Kelly, I would absolutely have said yes to a clinical trial if someone had told me about it.
Yeah. And I think it's worth noting that clinical trials aren't just for drugs, right? They're for devices, they're for new treatment pathways as well. So anything that receives regulatory approval, and that means the FDA says that it's demonstrated that it's safe and effective for the general population, does have to go through a clinical trial. But let's go back to pretending what if, right? We can't take your TBI away. But knowing what you know now, what would have made the process easier for you? Is there any one thing or one bit of information or one person that you talked to that if you would have done it differently or would have done it earlier would have made your journey different than it is today in a better way? There's lots of things that probably would have made it worse.
Well,
go ahead, Jeff. Yeah.
That's insurance. I mean, plain and simple. Like, with every headache, there are two kinds of headaches. There's the headache in your head, and then there's the headache of dealing with the insurance company to solve the problem. And fucking nightmare. That's all I can say. Again, I got lucky because I was in the office, looking like hell and feeling like hell. And the CFO's like, bro, I shouldn't say that. But I went into her office and she said, like, why are you here? And I explained it to her. And she said, look, I just looked at your file. You have disability insurance. Why aren't you using it? And I was like, well, I feel like it's going to be kind of a black mark against me and whatnot. Because if you take advantage of a benefit, oh my God, you're a pariah. And she told me the story of her husband who had been through something very similar in terms of a chronic condition. And he had done it and it had been fine. Based on that, I decided to do disability. And so then I had to deal with the disability. My girlfriend, ex-wife, whatever, at the time had to deal with it. And I can show you the file that we ultimately put together or it was put together by my lawyer to get the insurance settled. It's that thick. Like, it's incredible. Every single thing I wanted to do, no. Every single time I said I was getting a little bit better. Oh, great, we're cutting you off then. And I'm not making this up. I told them I could empty a dishwasher. And they're like, well, great, you can go back to work. Like, okay, wait a minute. Running an ad agency's creative department is a little different from unloading a dishwasher. They're like, no, it's not. And then you had to fight them. And that went on for probably 2 years. It's just unbelievable. And, I sympathize a little bit. There's an incredible amount of fraud out there. Like, these insurance companies are being cheated left and right. And so their attitude is, well, we're going to do the same. And it's created this impasse. So to my mind, whenever you have something like all of us are talking about today, a chronic condition, the number one barrier between you and treatment is insurance. Number one. Now, if you're, I don't know, Elon Musk, it's not a problem. But, if you don't have that kind of money, it's a problem. And then the other problem is time. Like, so talking about clinical trials, oftentimes, if you want to really participate in the clinical trial to the point where you're going to actually, create valuable data, that's a commitment. You can't just show up 30 minutes a month. It would be very difficult for me, say, for example, like, I've already taken up to 2 or 3 months off at Dell in the past. I can't keep pushing that. Like, they've been incredibly supportive and accommodating and all these things, and I love them for it. But I also know that it's not an infinite well of goodwill. It's just not. So to me, that's the number one thing. Even if you become aware of things that might help you, great, you got to run the insurance company. And that's very, very difficult, especially dealing with fatigue and confusion and stuttering and your brain blanking out on you and just on and on and on. It's horrible.
And we do need to make it easier for people to participate in clinical research, to navigate different systems, and to, know about what options are out there. So, yeah, absolutely. It's time for us to wrap up, which I can't believe because this almost hour has just flown by. I'd really like to end with all of you telling us and telling the audience what's one thing that you want people to know. What's one thing that you think others really could benefit from? Marie, let's start with you.
That's a really tough question. I think my one thing would be, and yeah, I think this applies to this topic, but I would say just about your, when it comes to health and wellness in general, right? Like, you're allowed to take control. You don't have to just accept, rest and wait. You can, pursue treatment options that make sense for your body and your life. And, you know, anytime, whatever has happened and, someone recommends an invasive procedure or something like that as like the first thing we're going to try, I'll go and get a second opinion, a third opinion, a fourth opinion, right? Like I would make sure for myself I'm, making a, best informed decision with data from lots of different sources so that, um, I can make the best choice for myself. So I think it's about, you know, being okay and, being willing to take control of your situation, especially with things like this where it's, people don't know, what, how to really treat this stuff or what are the best ways. So I think that's kind of been my biggest takeaway from all this.
And Wendy, why don't you bring it home for us? What's one thing you want people to know and what's up next for you?
I would say, and I said it took me a few years to get here, but it's figure out how to live with it, right? And Marie, you said power. I would say the same thing. Like figure out how to take agency back. When this process started for me, I trusted myself a tiny percent, and I put all my trust in the medical system because we have scrambled brains. We're not thinking clearly, and we're dealing with something we've never dealt with before. But as the process went on, and as the fewer treatments were available, and you start to figure out that you have to live with this, take the power back. Trust yourself to make the decisions. And like I said, figure out a way to create a life with it because it isn't leaving as much as we'd like it to. It's like I quote Dexter, it's like having a dark passenger all the time.
Well, with that, thank you all for sharing your stories and your journeys. And I wish you health and happiness. And Wendy, thank you for the opportunity to host this podcast.
Kelly, thank you so much for leading the conversation. This was really great. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for joining us for today's panel episode about living with TBI. If this episode resonated with you, or you know someone who could benefit from it, please consider sharing it with them so they can find our community. And to support our work, you can like, comment, subscribe, share, or join us at bestguessistan.com, where you can also bring us your rupture. We would love to hear your story.